A long time for civilizations to move from slavery to Jim Crow to genocide to imperialism to neo. That's a long time to make the same error consistently that seems to benefit the same people century after century. So think about this for a moment. When we talk about moral ideals and ethics, we talk about moral sensibilities and character. What would a virtuous person do under conditions of freedom? So we think, for example, when we have children, if we tell our child that they have to do this thing over and over again because it's the right thing, we don't think the child develops. But if the child chooses for him or herself, oh, well, then we have a great child. We value people who make the choice for themselves. That's the idea behind morality and ethics. So when groups of people, races of people, nations of people make choices about behaviors or actions or types of government, we're evaluating whether or not they're making good choices. But Chamberlain says those good choices are built up in a realm of impulses that are linked to a people, to a race. And certain groups of people are loyal because they're like dogs, like black people. And other groups of people whose loyalties are manifested through freedom and choice are civilized and rational. Now, when people talk to you about universal values, this isn't the history you're going to get. You're going to get the will for all, brotherhood, equality. Everyone should be free and rational. But rationality has exemptions and they have constraints. Now, some would argue, well, Curry, this is just a matter of interpretation, right? We're bogged down by language. Back when I was in grad school, the one analytic philosopher I did like was Quine. It's tough. Analytic philosophers are tough to deal with. They're dry people. But Quine makes an interesting point. He's talking about linguistics, but he makes this point that I think translates to values. He says, listen, when one group of people goes to a different culture, they try to link objects and the appearance of objects to how they think certain ideas are associated with them. So if I walk into a culture and I see a table and these people say the word, a different word every time we see table together, I say, oh, that word means table, for instance. But he points something out. He says, well, look, if an English-speaking person goes to a native community and they see a rabbit, and every time the native community says rabbit, they say gabagai. So the English-speaking person, oh, gabagai means rabbit. But he says, well, look, that's how they think about it because of their cultural schema. You see an object, you associate the object with the word. But what if this other indigenous group says, well, it's not just the rabbit, it's the way the earth moves, the grass flutters, the way the sound embodies rabbitness. You see, there's an incompleteness. If you're into semiotics, what is signified by the word doesn't capture its full meaning, right? So there's a gap there. Well, what if it's the same case for values? What if people outside a group who are not oppressed, who have a different history, simply cannot understand the richness or all the meanings associated with terms like freedom, even though they think they share the same idea? See, this becomes the basis of how the modern world and the democratic society imposes itself on people who don't have the ability or more or less the power to assert their own self-determination. If you say, let's get rid of segregation, now you're free and don't address the ideas of inferiority, that's not freedom. If you get rid of apartheid, but you keep everyone in poverty, where the people who stole the wealth of a country still become rich and you still remain poor, that's not freedom. But the universalist says we've eliminated the thing that we've defined and articulated as the barrier to our understanding of freedom, and that thereby becomes the basis for a generalizable understanding of what freedom is and shall be. So it's under these conditions that universalism asserts itself as being generalizable to all, but ignores the error and the failures associated with its problems. This is why we have theorists like Sylvia Wynter, who points this out, who says, listen, we start from the view that the human being constructs values and mediates them. But what if the problem is the human being itself? What if we don't have a shared notion of humanity? What if the human itself is a cultural construction that certain groups of people rationalize and utilize as if they're the basis of everyone else? So like the Copernican revolution, this is a piece that precedes this. She says, look, you can't solve the issue of consciousness and knowledge within their body of knowledge. You just can't. Within the medieval order of knowledge, there was no way in which you explain why certain planets seemed to be moving backwards, because you were coming from a geocentric model. So you had to know the world in that way. Whereas from a man-centric model, we can't solve consciousness because man is a purely ontogenic and biological conception of being, which creates culture. So if we say consciousness is constructed, then we ask, who's doing the constructing? Who constructs these values? See, the anti-humanist makes an intervention into universalist discourse because they're asking a question. They disagree with the presumption that there is simply an agreed upon language, there's agreed upon values, there's agreed upon perspective from which you can view history and pull from it certain ideas that we think are fundamentally true. This is why thinkers like Norman Ajari, a great colleague I have at the University of Edinburgh, suggests that universalism becomes a false strategy of endowing credibility to values and ideas. It's in the particular. It's in how the people who are oppressed, the people who are marginalized, embody or aspire for a new world that gives it credibility and gravitas that pulls us to their ideas of freedom or justice. It's not through the ideas that we develop sitting in a chair. Now, universalists always take the high road. They want to articulate a view of human nature that's fundamentally good, optimistic, and rational. This is the basis of Kant's autonomous and free individual. But what if we took a more pessimistic view? Social dominance theorists and biosocial thinkers have a different view of human nature. They suggest that throughout Western societies, groups, specifically dominant in-groups, create mechanisms that mediate interracial and interethnic conflict and cooperation. Now, Vandenberg suggests that when we talk about human sociality, there are a few things that operate. The first is kinship selection. It's the ability of a group to extend its ideas to other members of groups. So if you're, say, Anglo-Saxon and you want a relationship with Toots, you can draw that relationship by saying that you share an idea. There's the idea of reciprocity, which suggests that people within dominant groups exchange resources, build things from mutual cooperation. But then there's coercion. And the coercion is usually a mechanism of antagonism that's held for people who are in outgroups. Now, Vandenberg suggests that when we look at history, Western society as generally, we see that coercion becomes the basis of ethnic and interracial relationships. And he asks a profound question. He says, well, it's strange because even though we observe this antagonism that people have to people who are outside of their group, not only in terms of how they're understood and what they think, but how we treat them and where we think they belong in hierarchies of civilization and being, we cover that with this appeal to liberty, equality, egalitarianism, and fraternity. So he sees the rhetoric or the pretense of universal normative aspirations, right? These universal values as being a legitimation myth used to cover and bring benevolence to the antagonism they hold to people who are outside of their group. Now, ultimately, I think the answers to universal values is an anti-ethical stance. We've been lured by the romanticism of believing we're all the same. We've had a hard time dealing with difference, much less difference from people who have less power or who are antagonism to what we think of as Western civilization in total. But there are certain beings in the world that are burdened by unrealizable normative aspirations and values. Freedom doesn't benefit you if you're dead. And we have to engage the reality of the situations that confront us not only throughout the 19th century with genocides, but also in our contemporary moment with multiple ethnic and racial conflicts across the world. What if those are not mistakes? The Universalist says those are mistakes in error, those are mistakes in judgments, we could correct them. But that's a long time to have an error, isn't it? A long time for civilizations to move from slavery to Jim Crow to genocide to imperialism to neo. That's a long time to make the same error consistently that seems to benefit the same people century after century, right? So what if we have to think differently about the kind of eschatological burden, or eschatology is a fancy way of saying the moral and ethical limits and consequences of death on our mind? Those become the burdens of our ethical failures. And it's in that particularity that we find reasons to question this shared brotherhood, this shared civilization.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.